learners, and welcome to the session on early stages of development. I am Professor Rosenembia Kim from the School of Social Work, Indira Gandhi National Open University. Now, what is about early stages of development? As we all know, we have a time from the time we were conceived to the inception and birth. And so these stages goes through a number and a series of development process. And we are here to talk about these stages of development. And in today's session, we will focus primarily on the early stages of development. Now, what is the session all about and what are you going to learn from this session? Now, the objective of the session is that it will familiarize you with the different biological, social, psychological, and developmental changes that take place in a human being during the early stages of human growth. It is important to understand because this helps us to understand when a person grows into an adult, what are the different kinds of aspirations, the attitudes that a person has is all dependent on the kind of the biological surroundings, the social surrounding, the psychological stresses, or the development changes that may occur. So this session will definitely help you in understanding and familiarizing yourself with all these aspects. The other objective of the session is that we will discuss 3 stages of life, which is namely conception, infancy, and babyhood. What is conception? Conception is when a child is being conceived, when a child is in the womb of the mother. So that is known as conception. And what is infancy? When the child is at a very young stage. And babyhood, when the child is able to talk or able to open the eyes and all. So this is what we're going to do in the session. And I hope that you do have a very good learning experience. Now, let us begin. After the objective that you've understood, what you're going to do or what will you understand after the session? Well, after the session, you should be able to describe the ways in which life begins with emphasis on the preliminary stages of prenatal development. Now, prenatal development is a development that occurs when the child is being conceived. So this is what you're going to learn. And you'll also be able to point out why and how certain factors at the time of conception have long-lasting effects on later development. Yes, this is very important to understand because the situation during which the child is conceived, they have a long-lasting effect on the later development of the child. You will also be able to understand after the session describe the various major adjustments all infants must make to postnatal life, the kind of situational changes they have to do outside the womb, because the womb is a protected area. So what the child has to do, what the child has to understand, or how the child adjusts is important to understand. So after this session, you'll be able to describe the major functions all infants must make to postnatal life, the condition influencing these adjustments, and the criteria used to assess their successes. You will also be able to recognize the characteristics of an infant, especially the physical features, activities, vocalization, and sensitivities. Yes, this is what we know as early development, the stages of early development. So you'll also be able to list the various development tasks of babyhood and describe the physical, motor, speech, emotional, social, and play developments in babyhood. Now, these are the different kind of features that the baby develops, or the different stages that the infant goes through while growing up as a child, and these are all going to help you understand after this session and explain the importance of understanding family relationships to the development of morality, sex role typing, and self-concepts in a baby. These are by and large what you're going to understand from the session. And we're going to break the sessions into 4 different sessions so that it helps you understand in a more detailed manner. So now let us first start the sessions in understanding the preliminary stages of prenatal development. Now, what is conception and human development? Prenatal development begins at conception or fertilization, What is that? This is when the genetic material from a male sex sperms, that is known as the sperm, the sex cell which is known as sperms, unites with the female sex cell which is known as the ovum to form a single cell called a zygote. That is the reason why we call this as a conception, because when the female sex cell along with the male sex cell, they unite, they form a zygote, and that is how the child develops or the child is conceived. Now the zygote receives 23 chromosomes from the mother and 23 from the father. So in total they become 46 chromosomes, and these 46 chromosomes replicate over and over as the zygote reproduces itself through mitosis. So that is what happens. It reproduces itself, or in simple words, it mitigates themselves. Now, if these chromosomes unfortunately is beyond 46, then we have a different sets of unwanted life aspects, which we will not be discussing here. However, in all, you understand that 46 chromosomes, that is 23 chromosomes from the mother and 23 from the father, both of them meet, replicate over and over, and the child is conceived. So conception takes place. Now this conception can happen only when the female sex cell, which is known as the ovum, meets the male sex cell, which is known as a sperm. Only when they unite, they form a zygote, which total are 46 chromosomes, and that is how the conception happens. Now, when you talk about conceptions, it is important to understand the stages of development after the conception. Now, these stages, I would request you to listen carefully, because these stages are very important and it will help you to understand the stages of development of a babyhood. So, let us go to the steps one by one. Now, the first step is the period of zygote. Now, as we said, the conception. How does this conception happen? The conception happens when 23, the female ovum, meets with 23 male ovum, the sex cell which is known as the sperm, and the female which is known as ovum. They meet and form 46 chromosomes, and together they form a zygote which leads to conception. Now this is the first period of zygote, that is known as conception to the second week, what happens in the development. Now let us understand. Approximately 6 days after fertilization, that is when both the chromosome, the 23 chromosome and the 23 chromosomes from the male and female respectively meet, fertilization takes place. Now the cells of the zygote become sticky and attach the wall of the uterus, where implantation begins. So that is how the mitosis begins, and it lines up to the uterus, and then they form and have the implantation which begins. Now the cell begins to specialize, some forming an inner cell mass which will become the embryo. Now embryo is where the child is protected, and it develops, the chromosomes developed into a full-fledged human being over a period of weeks, and we are going to deal with understanding what are all this. And now once the inner cell mass becomes the embryo, what happens is that they are forming a surrounding cell mass which becomes the support structure for the embryo. So in simple words, we can say that the cell begins to specialize, forming an inner cell mass which becomes the embryo, and some forming a surrounding cell mass which will become the support structure for the embryo. Now the zygote is still only about 0.01 inches long. Now this is usually the average the average length of the zygote, and this gets established within the embryo, which is protected by the surrounding cell mass, and that is how the implantation begins. Now this is the period of the zygote that we talked about, conception to second week. Now further still, what happens when the implantation happens? Now this implantation takes about a week. Finally, the zygote is totally buried in the uterine wall, and the period of the zygote ends. So once it is established, when implantation takes place, the zygote is buried in the uterine wall, and the period of the zygote ends. Now about 2 weeks have passed since fertilization, which corresponds to the first missed menstrual period. So that means when the implantation takes place, or more so in simple language, when the fertilization takes place, 2 weeks have already passed, and that is when the female begins to miss the first menstrual period. And that is how the cycle, in the same cycle, when the periods doesn't take place or the menstrual cycle doesn't happen, the woman doubts whether she is pregnant. Now this happens only when the implantation takes place and when the fertilization happens. So by the time a woman suspects she might be pregnant, the prenatal development is well underway. So what this happens is, when the fertilization takes place, the first menstrual cycle is missed, and that is how we know that the pregnancy is taking place. Now within this period, you have a change in the period of the embryo, which is unlike the first one, where you have the conception to the if you go back, you have conception to the second week. Now we have the period of embryo, that is the 3rd to the 8th week of the conception. Now, what happened during the 3rd to 8th weeks of conception? Now, all major internal and external structures form during this period. That means whatever the outlining of the embryo or whatever is inside the embryo, it starts forming. So that is happening within this period, that is the 3rd to the 8th weeks. Now, in the 3rd week, the inner cell mass differentiates into 3 germ layers from which all body structures will emerge. Now, when this happens, when the fertilization happens, you already know that the first menstrual cycle of the woman is missed, and that is when she suspects that she is pregnant. However, during that time, the prenatal development is already forming. Now, then comes the 3rd to the 8th weeks. What happens is that the inner cell mass differentiates into 3 germ layers from which all body structures will emerge. Now, within this, a primitive heart begins to form, and by the end of the 3rd week, connects to the vessels and begins to beat to form a cardiovascular system. Now, the heart is the first organ system to become functional. So, within this period, or by the end of the 3rd week, the first organ that is functional is the heart, and it starts beating. And that is how we understand that the prenatal development has come about, and the child is going to be born, or the child is being formed in the embryo. So, we all know that within the 3rd week, or by the end of the 3rd week, the heart is formed, which is the first organ within the embryo. Now, within the 3rd to 8th weeks, what happened? In the 4th week, it is important to know that the environment begins to affect the development of the cells. Now, that is the reason why within the 4th week, it is very important to keep the mother happy, to keep the environment stable for the pregnant women, because the 4th week is important as the environment begins to affect the development of the cells. Now, within this, what happens is by the end of 4th week, the embryo assumes a curved form, and the upper and lower limbs have just begun to form as tiny buds. Now, this is what happens during the 4th week. Within the embryo, the shape takes place where the baby's upper and lower limbs has just begun to form as a tiny buds. And that is the reason why we say the 4th week is important, as the environment surrounding it tends to affect the development of the cells and how the formation of the baby is seen. Now, within the period, again 3rd to 8th weeks, the embryo's body changes less in the 5th week, but the head and brain develop rapidly. So, what happens is, during this time, the period of the embryo, during the 3rd to 8th weeks, we can see that the head and brain develop rapidly. Now, the upper limbs now form, and the lower limbs appear and look like small paddles. So, the upper limbs, that is the hands, is also now formed, and the lower limbs, which is known as the legs, will start appearing like small paddles. Now, it is yet to take a proper shape, but you can see that there's a formation of the hands and the legs. Now, in the 6th week, the head continues to grow rapidly, and differentiation of the limbs occurs as elbows, fingers and wrists becomes more recognizable. Now, it is possible to discern the eyes and ears. That means within the end of the 5th week, we can understand that where the ears are, where the eyes are, or we can understand the elbows, the fingers and the wrist, they all become recognizable. Now the limbs rapidly develop in the 7th week and stumps appear that will form fingers and toes. So what happens is during the end of the 5th week, or you could say the 7th week, let us go again and explain that during the 5th week, the head and brain develop rapidly, that we all know. Now, within the 6th week, the head continues to grow, and now you are able to recognize the elbows, the fingers, and the wrist, and also some parts of the ears and the eyes. And towards the end of the 7th week, the small stumps that develops, and you can say that these are the fingers and the toes of the upper and the lower limbs. And this is the development of the embryo, which is discussed about during the 3rd to the 8th weeks. Similarly, now that we have crossed the 7th week, let us go and understand what happens during the 8th week. By the end of the 8th week, the embryo has distinctly human features. So the human features, as we talk about the eyes, the ears, the nose, the legs, the hands, the fingers, the wrists, all become distinctly human features. Now, all internal and external organs have formed, which means that by the end of the 8th week, you can see the formation of the embryo, or the chromosomes that was fertilized, taking a shape of life. The life form has happened. So all internal and external organs have formed. Thus, you can see in 8 weeks, a single tiny undifferentiated cell develops into a remarkable complex organism consisting of millions of cells, differentiate into the heart, which is the first organ to develop, the kidneys, the eyes, the ears, the nervous system, the brain, and all the other structures that make a great human being. So we all know that towards the end of the 7th week, the hands, the wrists and all are becoming recognizable, as well as the eyes and the ears. And towards the end of the 8th week, we see that all the internal and external organs have formed, and it is wonderful to understand that towards the 8 weeks, a single tiny undifferentiated cell that we were talking about from the beginning, it starts developing into a remarkable complex organism which consists of millions of cells, and which is distributed into the heart, the kidneys, the eyes, the ears, the nervous system, the brain, and so on. And that is what we call the creation of a human being. What happens towards the 9th to the 38th week? This is known as the period of the fetus. Now, what is the period of the fetus all about? In this period, the principal task for the fetus are to develop the already formed organ structures and to increase in size and weight. So, the 9th to the 38th week goes in already forming the organ structures and to increase that little human being that is created in size and in weight. So because if the weight is not proper, if the size is not proper, then we know we don't have a good growth, then it's not a good childbirth. So that is the reason why 9 to 38 week is also important, because that develops the already formed organ structures of the baby and becomes a great and healthy baby. Now, within this period, what happens? What are the external changes that happens? Now, during this period, the fetus's appearance changes drastically. Among the body parts, the head grows first. The skin, which has been transparent towards the earlier week, it begins to thicken during the 3rd month. So, earlier, if you could see most of the videos and most of the pictures, if you happen to see, you see that the skin of the child in the embryo is like kind of transparent, but however during the 3rd month it becomes thickened, so the transparent begins to move towards the thickening of the skin. Now the fetus's eyes move from side of the head to the front, so if the eyes are here, it goes to the front and it forms the eyes. Now nails appear on the fingers and toes by the 4th month that we have seen and established, and the pad that was looking like a paddle, the feet and the limbs appears at the ends of fingers that uniquely identify the individual for life. So towards the end of the 4th month, we have got the fingers developing, the toenails developing, and they start becoming a life form. So the head hair also begins to grow, but which is definitely scanty, and you cannot expect a full grown hair by that time. So a bone structure also begins to support a more erect posture by the 6th month. So all this happens during the 9 to the 38 week. So in order to summarize, let me just say that during the 9th and the 38th week, the fetus appearances changes drastically. The body parts also appear to be more prominent, and the skin, which was very loose and transparent during the during the initial period, becomes thickened during the 3rd month. The eye starts moving from the side to the head in front. The nails and the toenail starts appearing, and it identified the individual for life. Now, these are what happens in the 9 to the 38 week. And also, the most amazing factor is that the bone structure begins to support a more erect posture by the 6th month. Now, within the 9 to 38 months, that was what we talked about was the external growth, that within the external changes that happens in the embryo or the fetus. Now, what happens in terms of the growth of the internal organs? Now, by the 3rd month, the brain has assumed the basic organization that marks its later subdivision: seeing, hearing, thinking, initiating activity, breathing, and so on. So we all know that by the 9 to the 38th week, which is also known as the period of the fetus, there's a growth of internal organs. Within this, what happens? Within this, the brain has assumed the basic organization that marks its later subdivision. And what are they? They are seeing, hearing, thinking, initiating activity, breathing, and so on. So the 100 billion cells of the adult brain are already present in the fetus by the 5th month. Amazing, isn't it? So we all know where the 100 billion cells that we are carrying today, since when it is present. We know that it is present in us during the 5th month itself. Now, the nerve cell growth and establishment of connections, which had begun on the 19th day, continue throughout the fetal development. So this development keeps on constantly happening, which probably the mother or the person who is conceiving the child is not aware of, but it takes, the life form takes its own time, and it has its specific space and continuum in which it grows, in which it's developed. So this is the 9 to the 38 week that we talked about, which had the growth of internal organs. Now, similarly, within this time, what happens is in the 3rd month, the kidneys begin to excrete urine into the surrounding amniotic fluid. Now, what are these amniotic fluid? These fluids are what protect the child to swim within the embryo. So the fetus, which is within the embryo, is protected by this amniotic fluid, where the child is developing, and probably, for the lack of a better word, we call it as swimming. Now, what happens here during the 3rd month in the period of the fetus is that the sexual development becomes apparent in males by the end of this month, with the appearance of external sexual organs. So now, during this time, towards the end of the 3rd month, the organs, the sexual organs starts exhibiting itself, and you come to know the sex of a child. So that is what happens. And similarly, the kidney also begins to excrete urine within the surrounding amniotic fluid in which the child is there. The period of the fetus that we are talking about, 9 to the 38 week, the early signs of behavior. What are the early signs of behavior? Now, the fetal activity begins in the 3rd month, when the fetus is capable of wiggling the toes and swallowing. So what happens is the baby starts moving. You would have heard a lot of people who are pregnant women talk about, I can feel the baby move, and that is what's happening. And that is probably the 3rd month, where the child or the baby inside the embryo is starting to wriggle the toes. The fetus also appears to become sensitive to environmental stimulation, for it moves its whole body in response to touch stimulus. So whenever a person touches the womb of the woman, then you know that there's a slight movement depending if the fetus is sleeping or not sleeping. So it starts moving, even if there's some music or if there's some sound, you can you can feel, or the female, the mother feels that the baby is moving, and that is what happens. The baby responds to the touch stimulus, or the baby responds to a certain environment that is happening around him or her. Now, within this, what happens is by the 4th month, the eyes are sensitive to light through the lids, and by the 5th month, a loud noise may activate the fetus. During the same month, the fetus swims effortlessly. So yes, they were protected by the amniotic fluid, and during the same month, the fetus also learned to swim effortlessly and is becoming sensitive to light, and loud music may send certain kind of a response stimuli to the baby, and the baby starts moving. Now, by the 7th month, brain connection are sufficient for the fetus to exhibit a sucking reflex when the lips are touched. So that is what happens when the child also starts developing and exhibit a kind of reflexes when there are certain movement that is happening. Now, within this, by the 7th month of age, the fetus has a slightly better chance of survival outside the mother's body. We also have cases where children who are born immaturely, so that's what they call as a 7th month baby, because usually a baby is born after 9 months. So if you have a baby who's not developed fully, but then because of other medical complications, certain babies also are coming out in the 7th month, now have a slightly better chance of survival after the completion of the 7th month. But before that, it would be dangerous. So the brain is sufficiently developed after the 7th month to provide at least partial regulation of breathing, swallowing, and body temperature. Now, a baby born after only 7 months of development will need to be provided with extra oxygen. They will have to be given food in very small amounts and will have to live for several weeks in an incubator for temperature control. Now, why do we say this is because generally what happens is a child is born after the 9th month, the completion of 9th month. However, there are certain situations and medical complications that a mother suffers, and that is the reason why some baby are born prematurely. That's what they call premature birth. But then that could be possible only after the completion of the 7th month, because by the 7th month of age, the fetus has a slightly better chance of survival. Slightly is the word here, but not fully. But if the child is then definitely a premature child, they have to be given with a lot of protection and given extra oxygen apart from the food, and they would have to definitely live in an incubator for temperature control. Now, in the 8th month, what happens is fat starts appearing under the skin, and although the digestive system is still too immature to adequately extract nutrients from food, the fetus begins to store maternal nutrients in its body. But given a baby born at 8 months is susceptible to infection. So what happens is in the 8 months, definitely if you call 7 months and above a premature birth, then 8-month baby is definitely susceptible to infection, and it still has to be given a lot of care and protection. And within this period, what happens is the digestive system in a child, in an 8-month-old child, is still too immature to actually take out the nutrients from food that is taken by the mother. So the baby is not able to exactly extract nutrients from food and develop slowly, but definitely still susceptible to infection. Now, by the 8th month, the mother's body starts contributing disease-fighting antibodies to the fetus that she has developed through her own exposure to foreign bodies. What happens is usually when we talk about a mother and child relationship, the child takes the food that the mother intakes the nutrients from the mother body, because the digestive system of the child in the 8th month is still too immature. And at the same time, in the 8th month, the mother's body also contributes disease-fighting antibodies to the fetus because she has developed those through her own exposure to foreign bodies, and that is how the baby becomes born with different antibodies fighting agents, and that is how they develop the immunity in the first place. Now, this process is not complete until 9 months of fetal age and is very important because these antibodies help to protect babies from infection until around 6 months of age, when they can produce their own insubstantial amount. So what happens is, since the baby cannot eat food on its own and because the digestive system is still too immature, it takes or it extracts the nutrient from the food that is taken by the mother. And in the same manner, during the 8th month, the mother body starts contributing the disease-fighting antibodies to the fetus. Now, the fetus starts taking or extracting these disease-fighting antibodies, which develops in the mothers because of her own exposures to the foreign body. Now, this process keeps on happening until 9 months of the fetal age. So, they keep on exchanging and extracting, and that is how the fetus becomes more healthy. Now, what is important that the antibodies help to protect the babies from infection till around the 6 months of age, and slowly the baby in the womb, in the embryo, starts producing their own in substantial amount. So this helps the baby to fight diseases or to fight foreign bodies once they're outside the womb, and that is the reason why the disease-fighting antibodies of the mother is very important for the fetus to be extracted. Now, what is the importance of conception? Now, we've talked about the period from the 1st month to the 9th month we've talked about. Now, let us understand the importance of conception. At the time of conception, there are 4 important conditions that influence the individual's later development. Now, why is that important? Because for a child to grow in a certain environment, it is really important to understand the conditions that influence the development of a child. Now, the role of these conditions plays in the individual's development explains why the time of conception is probably the most important period in the lifespan of the human being. Now, having said that, what are the 4 important conditions that influence the individual's later development? The first one is the hereditary endowment. The second is sex. The third is the number of offspring. And the fourth is the ordinal position. Now, let us understand each one of them one by one. What do you mean by hereditary endowment? Now, as the name suggests, hereditary is something which is passed on from the child, from the mother to the child, or from the family to the child. Now, what is that? The first important factor at the time of conception is the determination of the newly created individual's hereditary endowment. Endowment is something which you passed on from generation to generation, and hereditary, as the name suggests, is passed from family to family. So this is what gets passed on to the fetus when the conception happens. Now, determination of hereditary endowment affects later development. Hereditary places limit beyond which individuals cannot go. Yes, now what happens is, when I take a certain, in terms of, let's say, my attitude. Now, if I inherit a good attitude from my mother or from my father, it is hereditary, it comes to me. Now, that is the reason why we say heredity places limits beyond which individuals cannot go. There are certain extent to which you can go when you have the hereditary endowment that is passed on from family to family. Now, for example, if a person is angry most of the time, that is passed on from the father or from the mother, then there's nothing much you can do. That is hereditary. So likewise, your attitude, your values, your ability to control yourself, all of them, what the child faces is a part of the environment in which he or she is born into, and that is called the hereditary. Now, if prenatal and postnatal conditions are favorable, and if people are strongly motivated, they can develop their inherited physical and mental traits to their maximum potential, but they can go no further. Yes, and that is the reason why when you have inherited certain physical and mental traits, you can expand it to the maximum potential. But beyond that, you cannot go. You have to be highly motivated for the same. Now, hereditary endowment is entirely a matter of chance. So what you get is a matter of chance. It could be the good, it could be the bad, it could be the ugly. Now, that is what hereditary is. You don't choose your parents don't choose you. It's just a matter of chance. Now, let us go to the second important point, that is the sex. The X and Y chromosomes are the sex determining chromosomes. Now, the mature ovum always contains an X chromosome, and if it is fertilized by a Y-bearing spermatozoon, the offspring will be boy. That is, X and Y chromosome gives birth to a boy. And if it is fertilized by an X-bearing spermatozoon, the offspring will be a girl, and that is what known as the XX chromosomes. Now, unfortunately, in India, what happens is we feel that the mother who is bearing the child carries the responsibility of giving birth to a son or to a daughter, but that is not so. So it depends on when the X and the Y chromosome fertilizes. So if X and Y chromosomes fertilize, the offspring is a boy, and if X and X fertilize, it is a girl. Now, the sex of an individual is important to lifelong development. And that is why we say X and Y or XX chromosomes. Now, studies on sex preferences of offsprings have revealed that the traditional preference for a child of given sex have marked influences on parents' attitude, which in turn affect their behavior towards the child and their relationship with the child. Now, if as a parent they wanted a girl and if they have a boy, then they might treat the boy like a girl and might not be very happy. Similarly, in the other sense. So one has to understand that the fertilization process of the X and Y chromosome is not in anybody's hand. Just as hereditary endowment is chance, this kind of fertilization of the chromosome is left upon certain chances. Now, coming to number 3, that is the number of offspring. While most humans are singletons, multiple births also occur. For example, Meredith in the year 1975 reported that 1 out of every 80 births is twins, 1 out of every 9,000 is triplet, and 1 out every 570,000 is quadruplets. So it's a very rare chances, but then you do tend to have twins, triplets and quadruplets. Now, when a ripe ovum is fertilized by one spermatozoon, the result will be a singleton. Unless the fertilized ovum or the zygote that we say splits into 2 or more distinct parts during the early stages of cell cleavage. When this happens, the results will be identical twins, triplets or other multiple births. If 2 or more ova are released simultaneously and are fertilized by different spermatozoa, the result will be non-identical or fraternal, like we say, identical twin or non-identical twin. Now, triplets or other multiple births can happen. Now, coming on to the fourth aspect, the fourth important aspect is the ordinal position. The fourth crucial aspect at the time of conception is the establishment of the new child's ordinal position among siblings. While this may change within a year or after birth, the child's ordinal position remains fairly static from then on. Now, because it's important to understand the child, the placing of the child. Now, the effect of ordinal position on the individuals depend on a number of conditions. The two most important of which are the sex of the individual and how individuals feel about the roles they are expected to play. So yes, the sex of the individual is definitely one of the important aspects and the role that they have to play within the family or within the sibling. For example, a firstborn girl who is expected to help with the housework and with the care of young siblings may resent the fact that the boys in the family have fewer domestic duties and are granted privileges and given opportunities denied to her. So that is what the firstborn girl may have a problem in regards to the domestic duties or taking care of the family, or if there are boys in the family, that they are given more privileges and opportunities as compared to her. Now, a second or later born boy may resent being bossed by an older female sibling or being treated as the baby of the family, while his female siblings are given more privileges and freedom than what is given to him. So these are also some of the facts in which the child may feel, discriminated or unloved or being bossed or, denied certain opportunities. So this ordinal position also makes a very important aspect, calls for a very important aspect of the development of a child. Now, some individuals also enjoy the role they are expected to play as a result of their ordinal positions, while others may not. So this is a very generic aspect. Now, when we mention that the effect of the ordinal position on the individual would depend on a number of conditions, we see that first condition would be the sex of the child, that is whether a boy or a girl, male or female. Whereas in India, when we are talking about the patriarchal society, the male has more opportunities or more freedom as compared to the female child. Now, for example, again, we mentioned that if the firstborn is a girl, then she will be expected to help with the household work, while the younger sibling, whether they are male or female, they're given less domestic duties and more privileges are granted to them. Now, if the firstborn is a boy, then full-on freedom is given to them and they're not expected to work much. Now, sometimes the older sibling boss over the younger sibling. So this could be also a lot of resentment. This could bring a lot of resentment among the remaining siblings. However, it is also important to note that some individuals enjoy the role they're expected to play and some are not. So that is why we say everyone is not similar. Everyone do not see the world as it's supposed to be, because everybody has a different kind of thoughts and different kinds of perspective. Now, with this, we come to the end of the session in regards to the early stages of development, and we shall continue talking more about the early stages of development in the following period. Thank you.